Hello, and welcome to Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and I'm so excited that I get to be joined once again by Toni Tresca.
Hey there!
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic, as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we're so excited to have you join us today for our conversation about 1993's Leprechaun.
This is our second recording of our episode on Leprechaun.
Second time's the charm.
Very good. Which I feel like, this is horrible, is more time than was maybe spent planning out some of the finer details of the film. This is a film that I struggle with in every way possible. I struggle to understand the concept of cult followings a lot of times. I struggle to understand how certain films manage to check enough of the boxes that somebody out there says this is the beginning of a franchise. So I will just preface it with saying that while I will see anything that Warwick Davis is in and have since I was a small child, that is perhaps the most shining of features for me. But before we even get there, Toni, what is Leprechaun about? What should people know about this film to explain the plot that is Leprechaun?
Well, I'll take a crack at it. So it begins when Dan O'Grady returns back to his farmhouse home in North Dakota, where he's just taken a trip to Ireland, but he has stolen a leprechaun's pot of gold, which attracts a very angry leprechaun who subsequently proceeds to murder him and his family. It's a pretty gory opening. And then we jump ahead where we see a man and his teenage daughter, Tori, in this farmhouse. And from here, leprechaun shenanigans commence. That's pretty much all the context you need, I think.
Yeah, that feels very right.
There's some other characters who get introduced vaguely, but they're not really that fleshed out. All you need to know is Tori, who is played by Jennifer Aniston, in a very early role for her. I was honestly so shocked to see her in this.
Mm-hmm. There is not a ton of scholarship on this. In fact, almost everything that exists out there is just acknowledging that this film exists and placing it within sort of larger conversations about appropriations of Irish culture kind of period, but certainly appropriating Irish culture and horror. And so there's some scholarship that looks at like the leprechaun as yet another entry and some of the other things that make their way in are sirens or undines or selkies or whatever you want to call them and how those manifest in the genre as well. Now there is going to be more scholarship on some of the later films in the franchise, and Toni and I, going to be working our way through this franchise, so that's exciting. But what are the things that you have on your list to make sure that we talk about regarding this film?
Well, I've got a little bit about the production. Production that we can chat a little bit about. And then I think I want to talk a little bit about the source of horror in the film and then take a crack at it. Maybe give it some more thought than, as you mentioned up at the top, the filmmakers themselves did. But I think it'd be an interesting conversation to place that, particularly to contextualize that as we go forward with the rest of the franchise. Touch on some of the performances, and then we can really kind of, once we talk about how good Warwick Davis is, we can kind of just, I think, slash into it.
That sounds like a plan. So tell me, because this is always my favorite part of our conversations, what are some of the things that are going on behind the screen that we need to know about?
Well, this was written and directed by Mark Jones, who, if this name sounds familiar to you, it probably does. He was a children's cartoonist for a lot of his career. He did a lot of those kind of things in the early, like in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So Scooby-Doo kind of stuff, Mr. T's show, the A-Team kind of stuff. So cartoons and early kind of television. He even did like the Police Academy and stuff like that. So
oh, wow.
his He's a very established person within the entertainment industry. However, at this time when he was making this film, he was primarily known as like a cartoon guy. So he wanted to be taken seriously. So, inspired by a Lucky Charms commercial and the film Critters, he was like, you know what I want to do? I want to make a movie about and it's tiny things, like tiny creatures attacking. And
And
that
can I
left
say this cracks me up that your sentence was, he wanted to be taken seriously. Inspired by a commercial on Lucky Charms and Critters. Like, we're already just entering a rich world of this man's imagination.
Indeed.
That I'm not sure, I don't know, I'm not sure I would follow up a sentence of, I want to be taken more seriously. Yesterday, I saw a commercial. Like, that just, I'm excited by that. So,
Well,
he was inspired by little things.
Indeed. And I guess seriously is maybe the wrong framing here. He wanted to be taken seriously as like a filmmaker. And so he thought his best entry point into the industry would be to take a crack at making a low budget horror film. So, and I mean, honestly, not the worst idea.
Nope.
It's a great start for many people in the industry, such as Jennifer Aniston.
Yep. It worked for her.
But so this film went ahead, but it was initially pitched and greenlit actually as a serious horror film. So the whole concept was going to be played very straight. It wasn't until Warwick Davis joined the cast and he kind of started improvising, and he was like, oh, maybe this is a little bit silly. Maybe we can take it in that direction. That they did some rewrites and kind of switched the tonal elements of the film. And then the studio also demanded that some of the film be reshot to make it gorier because they wanted to appeal to a little bit of an older audience there. So those are some of the behind the scenes things that changed, which is honestly pretty significant. I think that's kind of wacky to me at all that there was ever like a very straight, serious version of Leprechaun
but I do
there.
think the cold opening, you mentioned the goriness of it. I think the cold opening shows us what the potential of what a more serious film could have looked like in terms of just the fear of something that's so small lurking in places that you don't anticipate it lurking. I think that it couldn't have gone much beyond a short 5-10 minute sequence, which is probably where the need for the humor came from. But I think that you can see in this film that tension between the places where it is retaining the sort of vestigial tale of its straight horrorness with the overlay of these comedic moments in ways that I think don't always work, right? Sometimes they do, and a lot of times they don't in the film.
And here's a little fun fact. This doesn't have any bearing actually on the film itself. Excellent. Really, but do you want to take a guess at how long it took for Warwick Davis to put on the makeup that it took to play the character?
I want to say 7 hours.
Oh, 7. Okay, you overshot it there.
Okay, I did overshoot. Okay.
So applying the makeup took about 3 hours, and then taking it off took another 40 minutes. So 3 hours and 40 minutes a day spent on makeup, getting leprechauned up.
Yes. Which is one of the best parts of this film. And indeed, lots of films that are low budgets is that low budget, the best thing to do are practical effects. And practical effects are the ones that linger effectively the longest. And so I think the makeup is actually one of the better parts of this film. And you can tell that it took that time.
The makeup and the man in the makeup. I think
oh my gosh, yes.
I mean, Warwick Davis is clearly just like having a lot of fun. He's chewing a lot of scenery in everything from his like goofy one-liners about the Lucky Charms or the fake Lucky Charms because they couldn't get approval to use the real Lucky Charms. That's or amazing. Him like going around in the frickin' go-kart killing people in that sequence. Anytime he is on the screen, you understand the movie has a reason to exist.
Yes. And I think that you can see the ways in which this film fits within the larger sort of history and discourse of horror. Like, this film actually makes a lot of sense coming out in 1993 when you think about some of the films that have come out in the few years prior to it. So I think about, for example, Obviously, The Exorcist would have been way before that. It would have been about 20 years before it. But even Hellraiser, there is a recurring theme of what is scary, going not somewhere that's not America, and accidentally bringing back something that is distinctly horrific in its non-Americanness. And of course, in The Exorcist, it's who's Pazu? It's the demon. In Hellraiser, it's the Cenobites, and the box and all of that. And then of course here it's the gold and the leprechaun. And so we see that is not a new element of Leprechaun, but it is an important one because it's continuing this trend that is a very rich tradition in American horror that is really not until maybe around the time we start to get to Scream and onward, certainly by the time we get to Peel, that we're beginning to ask if maybe actually the worst thing is whatever's just lingering here in America. We also have the weird characters that this is where I find it hard to believe that this was ever intended to be played straight, except I know that Friday the 13th has played some of its films straight, despite the fact that there are these characters like Ozzy Jones, like who hires someone to come paint their house and is okay with them bringing their 10-year-old brother, and also as with the Wikipedia quote is, dim-witted friend, Ozzy Jones, to help repaint the farmhouse. But these characters, which I think this makes sense that this is coming from perhaps the background of Jones, like having Scooby-Doo, right? That's just filled with wacky characters that just you put into a text. But also, this is horror, right? Of the 80s and 90s, early 90s, where you just have these characters that are so weird. And in many ways, Ozzy actually reminds me more of the brother in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, whose name I can never remember, but who I hate with a passion untold. And I think that, again, this film feels very familiar, and that might be one of its greatest contributions, is that it's continuing a pattern of American horror.
Yeah, I feel like anytime when Warwick Davis is on screen, it's kind of like it's kind of darkly funny. He definitely feels in on the joke itself,
Yes.
which is maybe like for some people they're like, oh, I don't like how he's like winking at it or like making fun of it, but I don't know. He's in Leprechaun. I feel like you kind of have to make fun of it to make it work. Whereas like anytime or like with Ozzy, he's like it feels goofy. It feels
Yes.
just kind of goofy and sloppy. He's like freaking just so dumb. He runs after the rainbow. He like
Yeah.
he keeps making all these like asinine mistakes throughout here that it's just hard to take any of those sequences seriously. And maybe you're like, oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It does. It undercuts this movie. And because there are some elements that kind of do work, but anytime it just gets so sloppy,
Yes.
it's very disengaging.
And I think the fact that, as you said, that we feel like we are in on the joke with Davis, not to mention with the Leprechaun, but I think specifically with Davis, also allows us to feel comfortable being in that silliness, right? Like you said, it's not pulling us out, it's actually inviting us in. Whereas I feel very uncomfortable with how the film chooses to portray, particularly Ozzy, but some of the other like slapstick humor, it feels like we're being invited to laugh at rather than with. And I don't think that has held up well in the 30 intervening years between when Leprechaun came out and now. Whereas the humor with Davis does hold up in a way that feels enjoyable still.
Indeed. I guess now, before we kind of go into some additional critical elements of the film, I think I'd be interested in unpacking the source of horror in the film. So what do you identify as the source of horror at the core of Leprechaun? Is it just a fear of short people? What are we so afraid of?
That's a great question. I think it goes back to this fear of the thing which will interrupt the quote purity of the American family. And I don't think, it's not, I think that it doesn't take much to have that unravel. Like I realize that some of what I'm doing is perhaps more ambitious of a reading than this film allows. But, when you think about the fact that it's the dad and his daughter, and it's very clear that they are trying to make a new start. It's very clear that she doesn't want to be there. And it's also clear that like the thing she wants is to not live on a farm in North Dakota, which is super fair. But she wants to, live in the city and have money and have nice things. And then, of course, there is this idea, weirdly enough, that like the thing that can undermine the family the most is greed. Now, that doesn't work very well when you think about the fact that much of the foundation of America is built on at least capitalism, if not greed. I think it begins to fall apart there, except for the fact that this is being shown to us as foreign greed, right? This isn't the greed that's inherent to America. This is a greed being brought by someone else. And so I think that this film is trying to suggest that we could have a wonderful family unit if we just didn't allow outsiders and their money to get in the way, which might be too ambitious. I don't know. What do you see happening here as like that source of horror?
That was what I was going to kind of just like lightly touch upon. Is it seems to be in like the most broadest sense gesturing at greed, because I mean
Yeah.
the central conflict is set off by them chasing after the gold, Alex and Ozzy going after that at the end of the rainbow, which sets off the actual events of the film itself. Although those two don't really seem that obsessive. And so I
Right.
think then all we're really left with is that cold open. And so
Hmm.
I think it makes sense in the 90s where it's
Hmm.
Reaganism time, fear of foreign things coming into our country and wrecking our economy was at an all-time high in right
Hmm.
when this was coming out. So I think it kind of makes sense in like the to kind of identify that as a potential source of horror, and this just like
Hmm.
fear of the outsider um, coming in and potentially bringing their outside ideas of economic system, giving out free gold. But oh wait, there's consequences.
Yeah, that's amazing. I do think that what's interesting about this film, and I would say that this is true of other films that we've talked about that have cult followings that may or may not match certainly the critical response at the time the films came out, but that have perhaps explained why people continue to engage with them, is that I think that films like Leprechaun and I think that Friday the 13th does this. I think Nightmare on Elm Street always meant to do this more, so that's why I'm not lumping them in. But there is a way in which you can also read this film as the thing that is the true source of horror is the fact that people would have found the source of horror that they did, right? So there's so much of this film that, as you said, is about sort of Reaganomics and socialism and the outsider. But at the same time, you can watch this film and be intrigued by the fact that why did they set it in this sort of timeless farm, right? Like, why is it that they are trying so hard? And some of that was logistics, but like the impact is that we have this reminder that there never really was an American dream, right? That it was always fabricated. The set feels so fake
Mm,
that it's hard to see it as anything other than a fabricated version of things. Like the dad and daughter are never in agreement. There's no mother involved. So I think films like this become interesting in that it's very easy to quickly see that what is maybe the text's intended horror is not the source of horror you could just as easily walk away with.
yeah, I think that's totally true. It is really interesting. It's another. I mean, this is another kind of classic example from this era of just like weirdly conservative affirmative horror. I think
Yes.
we can definitely lump it in that camp.
But because the film is so intent on that as its focus, it is possible to read it as a disaffirmative text and as an ironic or unintentional, but nevertheless as a disaffirmative text that we are like, but actually, isn't the leprechaun kind of the only redeemable character here? Isn't the American dream actually just this constructed fake set? Isn't, America actually just filled with kind of people who don't even know what they're doing? So I think that's what makes this film potentially interesting and
Yeah.
potentially might explain some of its lasting powers, that you can just enjoy it as a goofy film. You can enjoy it as a film that just kind of confirms whatever it is you want to believe. But you could also read it as a film, particularly because I think Davis is inviting us into the jokes as the leprechaun, as a film that is actually disaffirmative almost despite itself. And that is interesting, even if the actual film itself feels very straightforward.
a good point. And I think that definitely could potentially explain its enduring appeal. Slash, potentially, I know this franchise gets weirder, and I'm hoping
Yeah,
weirder
it
means
does.
just wackier and more outlandish with it, and maybe even more experimental. Although it could just mean trashier. I guess that
Yeah, I
remains to
was
be
gonna say, I
seen.
think my understanding is that it's going to be yes. It's going to be all of the above because we're gonna go into space, as one does. But then we're gonna go into the hood. Literally, that's the title is Leprechaun in the Hood, and then Leprechaun Back to the Hood. And then there was an effort to team up to reboot the film series around the 2010s with WWE Studios. So there's like this interesting way in which this franchise seems to kind of understand, oh yeah, actually, we are weird, right? Like to misquote Kraft, we are the weirdos, mister. And it's like, I think that's what this film is series is ultimately going to do. And maybe they can do it because even as they were an affirmative film, they were like, yeah, but are we really? Right? If you're the only person you're actually rooting for is the leprechaun, can you actually see him as the problematic outsider? Or is he the hero of the show and everyone else is just the problems in the way? So I will be excited to see where it goes, but I do think it's going to take some time to get there.
Potentially. And so I guess now let's like dive into some of the other elements within the film itself. I don't think this is a particularly well-made film. It costs just
No.
under $1 million, as quoted by Entertainment Weekly. So it could have been a little bit more, a little bit less with and potentially definitely is a little bit more with advertising. Although it made that back at the box office.
Yes, it did.
$8.6 million. So I guess that explains why we got the rest of the franchise. But I
Yes.
don't. Hopefully most of that money went into paying the cast and crew because it certainly did not go into producing this film.
No. Although I don't know what the set would have cost because that was again clearly all built for this, right?
No, 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 no. That
No.
is reused.
Oh,
Most of
okay.
the set was reused from. It was filmed at Big Sky Ranch, where Little House on the Prairie and The Waltons were shot.
That's amazing. Which
Warwick Davis later said it felt a little blasphemous to
yes. Yeah, that
be
would.
doing that.
But and
That
again,
was
here's another place where there's an unintended potential for disaffirmative, right? They were filming on what would have been cheap. And clearly I could watch the film and in part because I'm not a big watcher of the Waltons or Little House on the Prairie. I didn't recognize any of those locations. And maybe I would have if I was a fan, maybe I wouldn't have. But I think that like the fact that it is being filmed on a set that is literally the building of a false American nostalgia is very intriguing, right? Because it's
mhm.
hard not to see the potential for that as like a commentary on how fake it all is, except for maybe the leprechaun. But yeah, I think you're right that even Jennifer Aniston, she had a limited script, she had
Mhm.
limited abilities to demonstrate her skill sets. I also find anytime it references teenage daughter, I don't know if it's that I'm reminded that the 90s had a different presentation of teenagers in their cinema or if I'm just confused about what I think of as teenager, but I think of her as being more like a young adult than a teenager. But the acting is pretty average or
Yeah.
lower. But again, they didn't really have a script to work with.
No, and not really a script to work with, but also not really finding any internal motivation themselves. They're not really reacting really properly to any of the situations around them, I don't think. There are like I think some of it is like yes, some of it is the script and that they
Yes.
get literally carved like stand-in cut wooden cutouts of what people should be as written on paper. But then the actors themselves, either in the case of the actor who is playing Ozzy is just chooses to
Mm-hmm.
ham it up so much that it just takes it into a goofy La La Land, or you have people like Jennifer Aniston who is so aggressively flat and unresponsive to anything that's going on around her. So I think it is some of the acting too.
Yeah, I don't think that's an incorrect statement. I do think that that definitely plays a part. You know what is nice is it's a tight script in terms of it's not
It's
a
true.
3-hour movie. It's 92 minutes and I want to go back to what you said about it making, making a profit, because I do feel, and we've talked about this before, that like there are quite a few movies being made today, especially as the landscape of entertainment and media changes, that need to understand that like that is your goal, right? Like if you're in entertainment, your goal is to surpass your budget, which means you can't be having a budget anymore of $250 million. And I'm not saying it should be $1 million, but like, you know, the nice thing is that this film achieved a lot of its goals. In fact, it even achieved the goal of Mark Jones, because his film certainly left its mark, no pun intended. Now, he doesn't go on to write or direct any of the other films, which I think is interesting. Do you know why?
No, I don't. I don't know why.
But so that'll be something kind of interesting to think about, but it definitely...
I'll see if I can't find out why Mark Jones doesn't choose to continue with the franchise when we talk about Leprechaun 2. Because it's an entirely new team, although it comes out just about a little over a year after the first Leprechaun. So the first Leprechaun released in the US on January 8, 1993, and Leprechaun 2 releases April 8th, 1994. So just a year later.
Dear heavens. That's always wild to me when that happens.
New director, 2 new screenwriters, and a new producer. So no one from the original core team decided to stay on for the next Leprechaun.
Yep, that feels right. Except for, of course, Davis stays on, right?
He does. He stays on for a while. He stays on until he has children. And then he stopped doing horror movies because he was like, he was talking, this is, I guess, a little unrelated, but he was talking about that in an interview about how he just, once he had kids, he was like, I've made quite a few horror movies already. I love the genre. I love watching it at Halloween, but it doesn't feel right now that I have children.
That makes sense, I guess. I mean, I'm not sure, as a non-child person, I don't know that I don't know if that's the decision I would make, but I could see how that could motivate someone. And it's nice to know that that's the reason, and not because, he thought the integrity of the franchise was deteriorating, which is good because we don't know how the integrity is going to hold up. So Leprechaun, a film that exists, that has Warwick Davis. So you should see all the things that Warwick Davis are in, that spawns a legacy that will take us eventually into space and the hood, and then return us back literally with a film called Leprechaun Returns. So there are some exciting places that we will go in our journey. Is there anything else, Toni, and there may not be, that you were like, we failed to talk about the impressiveness of the Leprechaun's driving skills?
I think I touched on that in my section about Warwick Davis's acting abilities, which are very good. I guess the only other thing is, I do wonder if part of the franchise's enduring appeal also has to do with its relationship to 2 different holidays. Yes, it's a Halloween movie, it's horror, it's spooky, but also this is a St. Patrick's Day movie. I saw this on earlier this year when they were just running it around St. Patty's Day. And so I do also wonder if its connection to the holidays has some impact on why this franchise has maybe survived when others from this, even from, I guess it's 32 years ago, but for others from this time maybe didn't.
I think that's an excellent point, because our films that have had a lot of staying power in the horror genre, in terms of you can guarantee that they'll be on some channel at some point, are holiday ones, right? Be that Thanksgiving or Valentine's Day or Christmas, of course. So those of you that are thinking about making horror movies, think about all the untapped holidays: Arbor Day,
Groundhog's Day.
And even that, right, we have with Happy Death Day a little bit, right? Like it's her birthday, but it's still a Groundhog's Day-esque sort of film.
I guess that's fair. I guess that's true. I think of that as more of a birthday movie, though, which is also a holiday.
That is true. But I don't know if I've seen, I've certainly seen films where the turkey came back for revenge. I don't know if I've seen one where the groundhog wipes people out. So there's so much room left. And we will, of course, be exploring this franchise later. Leprechaun is our next franchise that we'll slowly be working our way through. You can see and listen to all of our other franchise explorations, some of which Toni and I have enjoyed more than others, but now we can say we've done so many of them. And we will be returning back to Leprechaun 2, but we are going to take what will feel like a pretty sharp turn in our next episode, which is going to be on what?
We're going to be going back a few years to 1990, and we're going to be discussing Rob Reiner's Misery. And we'll also be discussing this in conjunction with, of course, Stephen King's book. And then I also recently saw a stage adaptation of Misery, so I'll be bringing in some theatrical context as well.
Oh, I can't wait. I really wish that I could have seen that production. It just feels like rewatching the film, I was just reminded of how enjoyable it really would be as the correct stage production. I could see there being bad versions very, very easily, but I could see there being also just a splendid version. And so I'm really excited to hear more about the production that you saw.
I'm excited, looking forward to talking about it with you as well. So join us next time. Go ahead and if you rewatch the film, maybe if you want to flip through the book if you have it, or I don't know, go to your library and read a book.
Yay! You, of course, can get a hold of us. The best way to do so is email, as I, the one who's technically in charge of our social media, grows increasingly uncertain whether or not I can handle social media. But you can always reach out to us through email. Thank you so much to Jackson, who makes all of our editing magic happen. We appreciate what you're doing. And to those of you that are listening, thank you so much for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spooktacular day.